Now it's my great privilege to introduce our speakers for today. My good friend David White has joined us from Austin Theological Seminary. Ask anybody who has studied youth ministry, been a youth minister, gone to seminary, they will have read one of David White's books because he has been, I won't mention the number of years he's been a leader in this field, but for more than 2 or 3 years he has been a leader in this field. I was studying his books when I was a youth minister over 20 years ago. That'll give you some idea of the bracket we're working with. And I ripped off his book on discernment, practicing discernment with youth, ruthlessly when in my youth group in Connecticut. David is such a value to us because he's one of the thought leaders of youth ministry, but he's also had years of both being a youth minister himself and running youth theological institutes where they gathered youth to reflect on vocation and deepening their faith. I'm greatly privileged to welcome David and his colleague. Each of these lectures is both a leading theologian and a leading practitioner. A pastor from Houston, Texas, the Reverend John Leedy, is the minister of youth and family ministry at University Presbyterian Church in Houston. He's had a passion for youth ministry. How many years are we going to date this, John? 15 years? Sure. Yeah, sure, we'll say 15 years. I noticed on his resume, you can see it on your own CV, that he's also an expert in the bagpipe. I think that's required to be a Presbyterian minister, but it's got to be around here somewhere. If it doesn't come before the end of the lecture, we'll just start a chant. We want the bagpipe. Now, please welcome with me David White and Reverend John Leedy.
I bring you greetings from Austin, Texas, and it's such an honor to be here on your esteemed campus. I am grateful for Skip's hospitality and for his staff and the way that they have so graciously provided for us these last 24 hours. So, as you know, if you've been participating in Yale's Youth Ministry Initiative, that youth ministry is in a very generative time in its history, in which more people are reflecting on youth ministry with more ideas and resources than in any other time in history. There's much good work going on, and today I want to argue that a way forward in youth ministry should include an aesthetic understanding of youth in ministry, specifically that beauty is a deeply theological, although forgotten concept, which sheds new light on youth and ministry. And importantly for our conversation today, I will introduce, a life in ministry attending to beauty is also necessarily, and by definition, a life of joy. So I just wanted to make that point up front. So I'll introduce the theory of the practice, and then my friend John Leedy will introduce a case study in which beauty and joy are featured. But first, there is a story to tell. At least since the axial age of the Greeks around the 5th century BCE, when they first started reflecting on the nature of reality, humans have identified 3 transcendentals, or perfections of being. That is, truth, goodness, and beauty. They have all 3 played various roles in philosophical thought. Some have claimed that they name human ideals, aspirations, or motives. They characterize the telos, the ends of our lives. Theists have often claimed that these 3 constitute the nature of God. God is truth, beauty, and goodness. As philosophy became systematized in the medieval period and forward, these subcategories of philosophy became more established: truth in the form of epistemology or logic, beauty, goodness as ethics, and beauty as aesthetics. And so we see moving forward, in the modern period, we see philosophers such as Immanuel Kant doing his work around critique of pure reason, truth, critique of practical reason, goodness, and critique of judgment, beauty. So this is a common sort of tripartite way of dividing up the philosophical project. But this is not a new phenomenon, thinking about truth, goodness, and beauty. In fact, the early Christian patristic theology is permeated with language that reflects these three ideas of the good, the true, and the beautiful. These three are not foreign to biblical writers. Remember, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And by life, the Greek is zoe, which means an animating force. Others have thought about it in terms of beauty. Some early theologians seem to perceive beauty as the most primary quality of God, without which the other qualities of God would be empty. Beauty gives fire and light to truth and goodness, making them desirable. Writers in the patristic period, such as Pseudo-Dionysius, Gregory Nyssa, Plotinus, and Augustine, all saw in the biblical text warrant for attending closely to beauty. But as the story goes, we enter into the modern period, and beauty played a key role, even though beauty played a key role in the early Christian period, up and through the late medieval period. One only needs to visit the great European cathedrals to see how key the role of beauty was in Christian faith and practice. But by the dawning of the Enlightenment, the modern period, the time of Descartes in the 17th and Kant in the 18th centuries, the Western world had come to think of truth as something capable of being conveyed in propositions. For example, I think, therefore I am. Even Christians committed themselves to rational propositions as a primary means of evangelism and catechism and apologetics. During this late medieval and early modern period, Christian scholasticism, with a focus on doctrines and concepts and ideas, reigned supreme in the Christian world. And today, the role of reason is self-evident for the church. Christianity has always held the importance of Christian ethical practice, showing hospitality of strangers, forgiving others, caring for the poor and imprisoned, living simply. All of these things were markers of the Christian faith. Arguably, however, ethics came to be especially emphasized in the modern era, and especially in the wake of modern industrialization, which dissolved the social fabric to some degree, creating poverty and crime and alcoholism and all matter of structural injustice. But we only need look at John Wesley in England and the American progressives of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, for example. I'm thinking of folks like Walter Rauschenbusch, John Dewey, Jane Addams, these folks who came to emphasize the role of ethics for Christians. And of course, the civil rights movement on through the 20th century, the civil rights movement, anti-war movements, women's movements of the 20th century, all made ethics central for many people of faith. So today, for example, it's unthinkable at Yale or any other theological institution, it's unthinkable for clergy and church leaders to not have facility with ethical thought. This is at the center of Christian faith. So truth and goodness have fared pretty well up through the modern period. But fate, however, beauty's fate didn't fare so well as for the sisters, truth and goodness. In the modern era, it is not so much the case that beauty was vanquished, as it was marginalized and trivialized. Science and business took center stage in the Western world, what came to matter most was what could be quantified as dollars or statistics. Beauty was marginalized, but was exploited for use in selling everything, of course, from cars to perfume, but in the process was reduced in a way to mere prettiness, decorative prettiness, which was never what the Greeks or the patristics, the early church fathers, thought of as beauty. They thought of beauty as a more robust, expansive sort of idea that we'll talk about in a moment. Beauty it had lost its place as a driver for values in life and society, and beauty became to be, in fact, highly suspect. It lost its place as a primary way of engaging the world, as in fact, a driver for truth and goodness, as a telos. So now it's time to say a little bit more about beauty as a phenomenon, to see why theologians today are calling for the church to reclaim it as a paradigm for considering Christian truth. Beauty has long been honored as a way of knowing. Throughout history, people across cultures have recognized the epiphany of beauty as unique among the ways of encountering the world. Navajo tribes, for example, once used beautiful sand paintings to bring the sick back into harmony with life, with the universe. Physicists and mathematicians claim sometimes to be led by elegance towards truth. Albert Einstein once remarked, "I have deep faith that the principle of the universe will be both beautiful and simple." But what are the qualities of beauty? Beauty, it seems, is not simply decorative as we have come to know it in our culture, but it holds ethical significance. Harvard aestheticist Elaine Scarry observes that when we encounter beauty, we experience a surplus of aliveness, a wake-up call to the plenitude of life. Beauty quickens, it adrenalizes, it makes the heart beat faster, it makes life more vivid, animated, living, and worth living. According to Scarry, beauty establishes a contract or a covenant between the perceiver and the beautiful object, compelling the perceiver to attend carefully to and to protect the aliveness of the beautiful object. Which brings us to a second moral quality of beauty. The beautiful fosters attachment that is also detachment. For it can only be perceived at a distance by letting it be as a gift. It consecrates otherness as good. It should not be consumed or co-opted into one's self-project. Once beauty is coerced or exploited for selfish purposes, its quality can only be diminished. And so this is, again, part of the quality of beauty is that it calls for its own protection. In the words of Christian contemplative Simone Weil, beauty requires us to give up our imaginary position at the center of the world. A transformation takes place at the very roots of our sensibility, in our immediate reception of some impressions and psychological sense impressions and psychological impressions. In the moment we perceive beauty, we are absorbed into the world. Have you ever been in a museum and been so absorbed in taking in the art that you have lost sense of time and place? This is what we're talking about. We're so absorbed into the world that we join with the community of beauty. We are recruited by it. It is recruited beyond ourselves. British novelist Iris Murdoch tells of a day when she was anxious, resentful, brooding, and preoccupied with her problems. But somehow, upon seeing in the sky a beautiful flock of kestrel birds, all of this fell away. All of the space formerly in the service of protecting, guarding, and advancing the self is now free to be in the service of something else. As Christians, we might say that beauty is the delighted vision of what is other than oneself, of difference created by the God who differentiates, pleasing in the eyes of the God who takes pleasure. Beauty is a palpable reminder that the world cannot be reduced to mere cause and effect. A tree is much more than we can talk about in terms of phylogenesis or photosynthesis or those sorts of processes. Beauty is a palpable reminder that all things participate in mystery that can't be rationally deduced. All things exist within an invisible nimbus of grace. All things point to God. All things bear witness, as Aquinas says. All things bear witness to God in their own way. So not only does beauty invite us into covenant with itself, but it makes us want to share it with others, friends, and even strangers. Art galleries and museums are filled with people who come to share experiences of beauty. Indeed, one of the most common responses to beauty, according to museum gift shops, is a postcard or a phone call to say, "The Impressionists are breathtaking. I wish you were here. Come as soon as you can." Beauty evokes in us a desire for community, to invite others to join us. Beauty also prompts an imitative impulse. The philosopher Wittgenstein says that when the eye sees something beautiful, the hand wants to draw it. And this also will remind you of walking through art galleries and seeing folks sketching out sketches of art. Beauty brings copies of itself into being. It makes us want to reproduce it, to take photographs of it, to describe it to other people. Sometimes the imitative impulse of beauty crosses sensory boundaries, sensory modes, such as when you touch or see the smooth cheek of a child, it prompts a caress or inspires us to play or care for the child. The crisscrossing of senses prompted Augustine to think of God when he touches something smooth and pleasant, or Dante, inspired by the beautiful Beatrice, to write sonnets of the landscape of God's salvation in which the beauty of God finally inhabits all creation. Childhood developmental theorists believe that before the age of 3, before the onset of language, young children perceive all stimuli cross-modally or synesthetically. Daniel Stern observes that child-directed speech, child-directed speech when adults suddenly take on this affect, "Hello, baby," and the sing-song voice that we get when we're around children. Daniel Stern observes that this sort of speech of a parent of an infant to an infant involves not only words, but rounded, alternating high to low pitch, affect-laden speech. Such sing-song words offer a verbal and affective embrace that at once invites the infant's attention and draws it near. At a recent Stanford study, researchers ran an endless loop in a special screening room of a recording of Chinese mothers cooing to their infants. And the researchers were surprised that stressed-out graduate students often came to sit in the room just to listen, to comfort themselves. Aesthetics seems to be a universal language that crosses cultural linguistic boundaries. The mother's beautiful cooing, even in an unknown dialect, traverses fields, crosses modes, affecting moods and behaviors of not only their infants, but of those stressed-out graduate students in entirely different culture. In his book, Only a Promise of Happiness, Alexander Nehamas concludes that beauty manifests a hope that life would be better if the object of beauty were part of it. From an explicitly Christian perspective, David Bentley Hart states that beauty seems to promise a reconciliation beyond the contradictions of the moment, one that perhaps places time's tragedies within a broader perspective of harmony and meaning, a balance between light and darkness. Beauty seems to absolve being of its violences, if only temporarily. Unlike reason, which is subject to endless charges of subjective bias, beauty is, in fact, objective. It possesses a phenomenal priority. We may quibble over how to interpret an event of beauty, but we cannot deny its existence or its quality. There's actually much more agreement in this world over what is beautiful than what is true. Beauty is ubiquitous. It appears on the vastest scales as the amazing... I couldn't resist. As the amazing photographs taken from the Hubble telescope of our beautiful orb show, or on the most minute scale as a floating dust mote in a sunbeam, or the Fibonacci pattern in the hair of Donald Trump. While beauty certainly plays some role in natural selection, it is not reducible to that purpose. As Dutch biologist F.J.J. Botandik, he put it simply when he said, "The birds are singing much louder than Darwin would allow." Perhaps the abundance of aesthetic explanations of evolution, the excess of beauty, is woven into the fabric of creation, and this points to God, whose own Trinitarian perichoretic life is characterized by beauty, and to a world's eschatological culmination in which all proximate reasons will pass away, survived only by the playful impulse to enjoy God's beauty and to make it manifest throughout creation. Beauty's authority is manifestly a public announcement. It is not a Gnostic secret. Beauty proclaims God's glory and creation's goodness with equal eloquence and truthfulness in each moment, in each interval within being. Consequently, Christian salvation cannot be partitioned off into the hidden depths of introspection or contemplation, but it interacts with the world. Beauty is there, abroad in the order of things. It is all around you, given again and again in a way that defies description, but also denial, with equal impertinence. Thus, beauty is a category indispensable for Christian thought and practice. And finally, and this is key to the purposes for this lecture today, in beauty across its many forms, we find enjoyment. We find joy, whether in the face of a child, a crashing ocean, a simple act of justice, a church at worship, we find ourselves caught in an inexplicable nimbus of grace. In these things, we find pleasure. Their form gives us delight, but moreover, we sense that they are more than what they seem. They are portals of God's own glory. But for Christians, joy cannot but be ubiquitous. So today we find ourselves in a postmodern era in which rhetoric has seemed to triumph over dialectic, style over substance. We have so relativized truth that we no longer trust it. We only need to turn to our presidential race to see that candidates create their own bubbles of truth, right? And young people understand this. They no longer trust arguments from first principles. Any advertiser, parent, professor, youth minister, church knows that trying to argue a young person into truth is a losing proposition. They seek something more. Postmodernism's denial that there is an overarching dialectic or argument by which a single and rationally ascertainable truth might be set above all merely contingent truths is not a problem for Christians or for Christian theology, which does not permit a simple abstraction from the story of the gospel to universal truths. It remains in the realm of the particular, the realm of beauty, the Christ event, with its melange of concrete sights, smells, people, animals, practices, powers, relationships. All of these things remain eternally the font to which we return to taste its beauty, but which will always elude the finality of our words and our moral principles. Christianity, it seems, is much better suited to manifest the luminosity of beauty than the abstractions of goodness or truth. For theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar, the very apex and archetype of beauty in the world is Jesus Christ, who is the form of all forms, the measure of all measures. In him, God uses created beauty to fashion an image, an expression, an exegesis of God's own self, God's own art, as it were. God's beauty is beheld in all of its fullness on the cross of Christ, bathed in the light of resurrection. There preeminently do the faithful witness the plenitude of God's self-emptying act of love. Von Balthasar saw in the form of Christ proportion, balance, harmony everywhere, in the relationship between him and the Father, the distance of humanity and the nearness of the Son, the relationship between servant and Lord, exaltation and humiliation, the relationship between promise and judgment, judgment and grace, master and disciple. Each of these seem unreconcilable tensions, but for von Balthasar, in the Christ event, all of these tensions are harmonized into for the eyes of faith. They are harmonized. For von Balthasar, the beauty of creation itself points toward the ultimate beauty in Jesus Christ, and our encounter with Christ directs us back anew and re-enchants creation so that we perceive beauty in a new way. What if, after all, the revelation of Jesus Christ itself determines what form it takes as a means of education and ministry? A form artistically rendered that evokes Christian discipleship as the art of living. What if truth and goodness are derivative of the very beauty of the gospel? What if the beauty of the Christ event, God's art, like Murdoch's flock of kestrels, compels us to surrender our preoccupation with ourselves? What if the beauty of the gospel provokes us to invite others, like patrons in an art museum, to come and see its beauty? What if the very beauty of the gospel invites us, like Plato's caress of a child's face, to replicate its beauty in our lives, in the relationships with others, and our relationships with the powers and principalities? What if the Christ event, like the loop of Chinese mothers cooing their infants, is a form of beauty that we return to again and again for comfort and embrace? So through the centuries, so now I'm going to make a move here to talk about adolescence, because adolescence, it seems, has an innate connection to the theme of beauty. Throughout the centuries, some observers have seen in youth a particular affinity to beauty. In 1904, the first theorist of adolescence, G. Stanley Hall, observed that adolescence is the vernal season of the heart. In other words, the springtime of the heart. He envisioned adolescence as a life stage attuned to aesthetic form. He asserted that adolescence is a time of wonder in which all creation, when peer relationships, created things, culture, art, the very workings of the world unfolding around them, is opened before the heart of adolescence in beauty and in wonder. In fact, it is their keen perception of beauty that drives adolescents in their development as persons, as communities, in vocation. Hall traced the vocations of many famed scientists of his day, scientists, artists, politicians, and business people, and discovered that the roots of their success could be found in their adolescence, in the experience of wonder, when they hit upon some question that held romance for them, that attracted them and appealed to them, and only later passed into study and precision and generalization. All of this begins in adolescence as romance, opening the eyes of wonder upon the world. Moreover, according to Erik Erikson, by mid-20th century, the task of adolescence is an aesthetic task in its very nature. That is, the crafting of a self, the construction of a self, drawing from the materials of an inner life and personal experience and the ways and the lore of the community around them. From that material, they construct a self, much in the way that an artist paints a canvas. Only when they find these selves are they knit into the fabric of the community and given a role to learn from the old, to teach the young. We might even say that Erikson's vision of community was itself a vision of beauty, an aesthetic construction to which the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Suffice it to say that there's much more to say about all of this, but suffice it to say that engaging youth in artistic expression of, for example, testimony, can be an important aid as they find or craft a sense of self and vocation. As I said, there's much more to say about all of this, but I want to talk now about potential pedagogical practices for ministry, for formation of youth. There's much, as I've said, much more to say, but for the sake of time, I want to forge ahead and assert boldly that beauty must be a part of our approaches for forming youth as Christian disciples. And I want to suggest three paradigms, pedagogical approaches for working with youth. And the first I want to name as beauty in creation, attending to beauty in creation, lingering in kavod. Of course, many of you will be familiar with the term kavod. When God created the world in Genesis, and he called it good, right? That's how we translate the Hebrew word kavod. But in reality, kavod is a much larger idea than can be expressed by the term good. It means weighted with glory. It means beautiful. It means shining with elegance. So lingering before created beauty sparks in young people a sense of wonder, a suspicion that things are much more than they seem to be. And so the world is held, hence, in mystery and contingency. The patristics, this was a common idea for the patristics. They believed that it was, in fact, beauty, created beauty shed abroad in the world all around us that points us towards and prepares us for the coming of Christ. They believed that if we could not open our hearts, if our hearts become so corrupted by acquisitiveness and consumer habits that we can't see the innate beauty of something, then we cannot hence see the beauty of Christ. And so they thought learning to see the beauty of creation all around us was preparation for opening the hearts of people for the beauty of God in Christ. And so there is a sense, just thinking about our own experiences with beauty phenomenologically, being in beauty and sensing its wonder, its expansiveness, its sublimity, we're cast upon the fact that it is greater than what it seems to be. There's something here, there's something behind this that is a mystery that draws us to it and beyond it. And so that's the role of nature, and there's, of course, much more to say about this, but I want to move on to the second paradigm and talk about the beauty of the Christ form. As I've said, the coming of Christ, the life, death, teachings, resurrection of Jesus Christ, is itself not reducible to systematic theology or words, as much as I enjoy systematic theology. It is, in fact, given to us as a life, as a story, as figures in a drama with a plot, and all of that is itself a form. It is an art form, it's a form of beauty. And so since we've forgotten that, we have forgotten how to portray that art, and so we tend to reduce it to a set of propositions or ideas or doctrines. What young people really yearn for are expressions of that beauty, artistic renderings of the Christ event. The form of Christ is much more, as I've said, than the quantity of doctrines piled onto each other. It is a form given to us in the canvas of creation through historical figures, actions, and relationships. And it is this beauty that we glimpse in the Christ event that compels us to faith. Christ is given in a particular beautiful form, and that demands to be offered in a form of art, artistically rendered. Thirdly, the third paradigm I want to talk about is our practices that point towards what I'm calling a liturgical model, which is, as you know, the liturgy is the work of the people. It is our response to the beauty of Christ. When we are compelled, when we experience Christ, the Christ event in its beauty, we are compelled, therefore, to reflect back the beauty in our own lives, in our own actions, in the church, beyond the church, the liturgy that happens within the sanctuary, and the practices of justice seeking and caregiving beyond the sanctuary. And so the beauty that we develop, cultivate in our lives reflects back to God our gratitude, and imitates the beauty of Christ in its own way. So those are the big ideas that I'm sort of playing with. And my friend John Leedy has spent a lot of time thinking about these ideas and has his own approach that I think you'll find interesting, a kind of case study about how one congregation, how one youth ministry program implemented this attitude towards beauty and pushes towards practices of beauty. So, John?
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank David White for this wonderful opportunity, and the folks at Yale for this chance to speak to you today about this crazy idea we had at University Presbyterian Church in Austin, Texas. Duty makes us do things well, but love makes us do them beautifully. The spring semester was a wearisome time of year for the youth group of University Presbyterian Church. For many years prior to my arrival as their associate pastor, and for the first few years of my own ministry with them, the spring semester was dominated by one major event, Youth Sunday. Come mid-January, we shelved the Bible studies, put away the recreation equipment and mission supplies, and hunkered down to get to work. Youth Sunday at UPC looked very similar to our church's regular Sunday morning format. With the patient guidance of our adult advisor team, the youth would spend 3 months writing prayers, choosing hymns, researching and preparing exegetical notes for their senior sermons, and coming up with some new yet congregationally palatable spin on the passing of the peace. After a dress rehearsal and some lector training, the youth would show up on Youth Sunday and lead the congregation in worship. In the receiving line after worship, the church members would greet the youth and congratulate them on another fine worship service. And then the youth group would return to our regularly scheduled programming. This was the cycle that I inherited and what the members of the youth group came to expect in our yearly curriculum. But as the years went by and we cycled through this Youth Sunday routine again and again, I began to notice a few trends that gave me pause. I noticed that the energy and the momentum of the youth group would grind to a halt when we would begin work on Youth Sunday and would only dwindle as the weeks went on. I also noticed that there was much focus spent on the writing of the worship materials, that by the time everything was written, the youth had very little energy to present the material with much passion. It was as if they had stared at the words on the page for too long to see them eventually come to life on Youth Sunday. And when it came to examining how the youth participated in the service, some of the seniors didn't appreciate the obligation or the sense of duty to write and prepare a senior sermon, and for many of them, preaching was not one of their gifts. I had a young woman express to me that she wished she could have written a piece of music instead. And finally, after reflecting with the youth group on their thoughts about the idea of Youth Sunday as a whole, I realized that there was very little ownership in the service itself. The youth group felt that it was their duty to put the service together, and they did it well. But I got the impression that very few of them would have noticed if Youth Sunday didn't make it into the spring lineup. They did it because they thought they had to. And as I examined these trends over time, I came to realize what this service was lacking. The youth ministry team was doing a great job teaching the youth about the parts of the liturgy and guiding them through the thoughtful exegetical process for sermon writing, and the prayers and the litanies were well written and seasonally appropriate. And the youth were engaged in that good and formative behavior of leading in worship and public speaking. What we were lacking was a sense of beauty. The service kept coming across as being highly cerebral, mechanical almost. The service was missing that joyful energy, that creative passion, that spark of youthful exuberance, that indescribable thing that draws the heart and the soul into the mystery of the worship event along with the intellect. By the time Youth Sunday arrived, the youth themselves were sick of it, and they were ready to get it over with and move on to the next thing. They weren't having fun with it. They weren't able to play, to experiment. They weren't finding the joy in the experience of preparing for and leading worship. Something in the system of Youth Sunday was broken. So 4 years ago, I began trying to figure out how to tweak our yearly Youth Sunday routine into something where the youth group could find more engagement, purpose, and yes, joy. And at the same time that I was trying to figure out what to do with Youth Sunday, and in another corner of my vocational passion, I was also trying to figure out how to start an Easter vigil at University Presbyterian. As a seminary student at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary, I'd become enchanted by the profound holiness and mystery and pageantry of this Saturday evening Paschal liturgy, and made it my mission upon graduation to get a vigil started at the church of my first call. The funny thing is about seminary is that they often let young pastors discover for themselves how to get laughed out of a staff meeting when you ask other pastors or music staff to assist in an additional Holy Week service on top of everything else already going on. UPC already had a Maundy Thursday and Good Friday service, and I just couldn't find that principal leadership for this new worship idea here at UPC. And I'm embarrassed to admit how long it took me, and I wrestled with these two issues before it finally hit me. Something had to be done about Youth Sunday, and I really wanted to get an Easter vigil started. And I was actually about ready to give up on both ideas around 4 years ago when the two issues at last came together and coalesced into something totally new. Something that would not only reinvent a youth-led service of worship, but would reshape the vigil as well. The idea was to get rid of the traditional Youth Sunday in its entirety, and instead give the youth responsibility for the central liturgical celebration of the Christian year, the great vigil of Easter on Holy Saturday. The youth group would no longer sacrifice 1/4 of our year to writing prayers and choosing hymns. We would instead use the liturgy already in the Presbyterian Book of Common Worship, and the scripture readings would come from the Revised Common Lectionary. I would choose the hymns. We would shift from having senior sermons to having the youth write a brief dramatic proclamation or mystery play in which any of the youth of any age could participate. In my estimation, with the liturgy written and the music chosen and the burden of senior sermons lifted, our preparation time could be cut from 3 months to 1 month and a lock-in. The ultimate vision for the youth's involvement in this project was to enable them to pour 100% of their energy and passion into the interpretation of the Easter Vigil liturgy and its resurrection message. I didn't want them to merely create something that was done well. I wanted to clear the way so they could create something beautiful. And rather than simply putting together another worship service, the youth would be freed to create an entire world, an alternative reality, a liminal space of holiness in which the imagery of the vigil could soar in the spiritual imaginations of those who would gather that night. I wanted them to dive headlong into a re-enchanted resurrection story, the great Paschal mystery, like Ellis through the looking glass or the Pevensie children peering into Narnia through the wardrobe. Throughout the course of this new endeavor, my hope was to be able to move the youth group to a place of seeing their leadership in a service of worship as a twofold gift rather than an obligation. Twofold in the sense that not only would the youth group be offering the gift of their own creativity and passion to bring the Easter story to life for the congregation, but in turn they too would enter into the world of the story themselves, thus receiving the gift of its resurrection message. My hope was that by participating in the act of preparing and leading worship in this new format, they would hear and see the good news of God's love in ways that made sense to them, and then translate that love into a thing of beauty which they would then share with the church. The Easter Vigil itself is a 4-part service that concludes the great 3 days, or Triduum, of Holy Week. Following Maundy Thursday and Good Friday, the vigil begins at twilight on the Saturday prior to Easter Sunday with the lighting of the new fire, the first of the service's 4 parts. My youth group was very excited about the idea of lighting a big bonfire in the main courtyard of the church, and in fact, the role of fire starter continues to this day to be one of the most highly coveted positions among my teenagers. After the new fire and paschal candle are lit, the congregation then processes to another area of the church for a series of 12 readings from the Old Testament, the second movement of the service. These are the big stories of the salvation history of God, and this movement of the service is where the creativity of the youth could really shine. During the preparation process, I printed out a list of the readings, and together as a youth group, we read through them. As we read through the readings, I asked the youth to dream big about how they would interpret the stories through their eyes. I asked them to find the beauty in the poetry, the actions, and the emotions of the characters. I asked them to locate the mystery within each story and the questions the text would raise in their minds and hearts. Following this exercise, we created an idea board for each of the readings. And of course, some of the readings we had to finesse a bit. No, we couldn't actually have a pillar of real fire in the church. And no, we couldn't actually find a young boy in the children's ministry to bind to a wooden altar and attempt to sacrifice, like in the Abraham and Isaac story. But as the youth worked with their imaginations, amazing and beautiful interpretations began to take shape. In the first reading of the creation story in Genesis, they focused on the ordering of creation out of chaos and developed a plan for each of the youth to have a colored ribbon, one for each of the days of creation, and to wave them in this chaotic fashion until the God figure, also played by one of the youth, began to conduct their colored ribbons into patterns of movement that fell into harmony with one another. The youth had the idea of building this giant white fabric screen, which you can see up there, with the hope of projecting light and doing silhouette acting that could be a subtle way of illustrating the story. So together we built this 30-foot by 10-foot screen onto which we have portrayed the rainbow of the Noah and the Ark story, Jonah in the belly of the great fish, and good old Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. 2 of our youth were in dance classes, and they agreed to choreograph a routine to the Ezekiel story of the Valley of Dry Bones, which to this day has been one of the least cheesy liturgical dance routines I have ever seen. Some of the props that were created were this large Red Sea banner that could be separated to allow the Israelites to pass through, and just different props throughout the years that they've created. However, some of the interpretations were more subtle. For the story in Genesis where God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, the youth wanted to ask a young boy from the children's ministry to read that story. Folks, to hear the words, "Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" spoken from the mouth of an 8-year-old, brings into vivid relief the horror and emotional brutality that Abraham must have been feeling in that story. For the reading of Proverbs 8, the youth focused on the feminine imagery of God in wisdom's call and asked one of the female youth, her mother, and her grandmother to read the story as a choral reading. It was wonderful to see the youth begin to reach outside of themselves and invite children and adults to share in the leadership of this service and to give an intergenerational voice to their vision. And whenever we would walk alongside the youth group through this process of hearing and dreaming about these Old Testament stories, the energy and creativity of the youth pulsing through the room was palpable. They were playing with these stories. They were having fun together, bouncing ideas off one another organically. They were doing the work of interpreter, preacher, artist, poet. They were dreaming these stories to life, and they were becoming drawn into their life and their personhood. In addition to their interaction with the story, the interpretations that the youth decided on called up a broad diversity of gifts to bring their ideas to being. Dancers, artists, builders working with power tools, actors, orators, singers, readers, designers, all found a way to contribute their gifts to this service of worship. This tapestry of imagination allowed the youth to form themselves into a mosaic of gifts, each contributing his or her own unique expression of who God had created them to be as an offering of praise. The beauty, the emotion, the poetry, the mystery of these stories was shaping and reshaping their lives, imprinting these ancient texts onto the fabric of their personhood. Following the service of readings, the congregation would then process to the third movement of the vigil, the renewal of the baptismal covenant. Gathered in the narthex of the church, around our large 8-sided copper baptismal font, the youth in confirmation affirmed their faith using the words of the Apostles' Creed and prayed together over the water. Following these liturgies, the pastors would take bunches of rosemary and sprinkle the congregation with water as bells were rung and the people sang a joyful chorus of music. I say sprinkle. With water streaming off the brass light fixtures, running down the walls and windows and being wiped from the faces of startled church folk, the renewal of the baptismal covenant came to hold a special place in the hearts of the youth group. Above the sounds of bells and singing, the narthex of the church resounds with laughter and shouts of joy as the people of God take a moment to play with one another in that holy place around the font. Like children splashing in a puddle or dancing in the rain, adults and youth alike duck and laugh and duck for cover, flick water on one another. That's my favorite part. And laugh and giggle as the rosemary bunches are dumped again and again into the overflowing font. It is a beautiful moment, a playful moment, a genuine and authentic moment, a moment when the formality of worship dissolves and we are welcomed as children into the lap of Christ. The laughter is honest and hearty, and there is a very healthy lack of concern for the state of the church carpet. It is a moment when we could truly say, with joy, let us remember our own baptisms. After the splashing and singing come to a close, we open the doors to the sanctuary and the great Easter proclamation is shouted, Christ is risen, he is risen indeed, and we process into the sanctuary to the first hymn of Easter. Once inside the sanctuary, the fourth and final movement of the vigil begins with the epistle and gospel readings, followed by the dramatic interpretation of the word that the youth themselves had written. Following these liturgies, the youth would then, alongside the pastors, lead the congregation in the liturgies of the Eucharist, and we would share in the Lord's Supper with one another. It's at this point during communion, 2 hours into the service, that the youth enter this strange adrenaline-fueled giddiness and begin singing the communion music at the top of their lungs and dancing and swaying with one another in the pews. The first year we did the vigil, my knee-jerk reaction to this behavior was to give them a dirty look and to tell them to knock it off. This was communion, after all. It's the serious moment of the service. But as I watched them, I realized the goals of the vigil had finally come to fruition. Everything that I had wanted this experience to become for them burst into being as the true meaning of communion, as the joyful feast of the people of God came to life before my eyes. And for the past 3 years that we have held the great vigil of Easter at UPC, this same spirit of joy breaks over the youth at this moment as they encounter the presence of the risen Christ at the table. At the conclusion of the vigil, after the benediction and dismissal, the youth gather back in the sanctuary, tired but exhilarated, to help clean up and reset the spaces for the next day's Easter services. After this year's Easter vigil, just a few weeks ago, upon entering the sanctuary, the youth went immediately to the communion table to begin eating the rest of the leftover communion bread, dipping their pieces into the cups of juice. The atmosphere around the table was a celebration, with gales of laughter and excited chatter as the youth recounted their roles in the service, laughing and joking with one another. As I was standing with them, I thought back to that energy of the youth group after our last of the traditional Youth Sunday services, disconnected, dispassionate, and weary. This new world of the Easter Vigil had sparked a change in the hearts of these young people and had reinvigorated a sense of purpose and imagination among them. Not only had they done well in the proclaiming of the good news of the gospel, but they had created a thing of beauty, something unique and wondrous, and in so doing, had themselves become a thing of beauty. The youth group had become the joyful reflection of the image of Christ, risen and gathered once again at table with his disciples. Thank you very much.